We can open the floor for questions now here in the room. And Tom, maybe you can monitor the chat and see if we have anything in the chat. I'll pause for a second. Are there any questions here?
Mostly just a stream of appreciation.
A stream of appreciations. Very nice. Well, as we've done today, a chair then could ask a question or so. So let me, I see a kind of tight connection between Abla Hasan and Rabia Harris's presentations in terms of thinking about epistemological, ethical, theological, and anthropological issues. So let me address that first. And then, Professor Cole, I would like to hear more about the meaning of peace and what, obviously a complicated concept, and how is that connected to nonviolence? We've sort of been skirting around those questions today, the difference between peace versus strategic nonviolence, practical nonviolence on the ground. But what I heard with Abla Hasan, you were addressing epistemological questions about how do we judge another's faith or the depth or the sincerity of another person's faith, which obviously are on the table. And I think Rabia Harris was also sort of talking about that. I did not hear you address the ethical issue where you started your talk talking about violence that was used against the unbeliever. I know you have the argument there, I just didn't hear the second half of it. So how does the epistemological question connect to the ethical question, whether or not violence can be justified in that case? And then I'll put that on the table. And then Rabia Harris, again, thank you for your inspiring words. And I heard you, I love this idea, God is not a tyrant. And I think then you also said no human being should aspire to be a tyrant. No human being should aspire to have that vision of God. So I would love to hear you just say a little bit more about the connections between the theological and the anthropological. You said that bad theology is rampant, but I also assume bad politics and bad anthropology are also part of the problem. So is that enough to get you all started on a conversation? Maybe we could go in order. Abla Hasan, maybe you want to start us off.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Now, in the presence of masters, I go last. So let's start with Rabia first, and then I can come back to your question.
Oh, Abla, you're too kind.
Go ahead.
No, I've just been at this longer, that's all. I won't lay claim to any kind of mastery. I've just been through the ringer. Oh, God. The thing about religion is that we talk about it as if its primary subject did not exist. If we call ourselves Muslims, we have to start by saying that God exists, and then go from there. We move, as thinkers, we are uncomfortable with that. Intellectuals are really uncomfortable with that. The academy has made this conversation totally off limits. But supposing there really is a unifying force or presence or consciousness or ethical underpinning to the whole world as we know it. That's where we're supposed to start as people of faith. And what we often do is say, oh, well, it would be nice if it were true, but somehow we have to make God real because God is not actually real until we've affirmed God's reality. Violence comes from the necessity of that one feels to either be God or do God's work for God. That God is helpless and I am going to do God's work. That's not happening. Or everybody thinks that, there has to be some kind of central figure in the world that represents God. Says who? The whole point of claiming as Muslims that there was a last prophet is that nobody has the right to take that position anymore. That role is done. Nobody is representing God here as a person anymore. Finished, complete. That means we have to, if we believe that God is active and God is present in the human world, that God is speaking not only to us and through us, but to the others and through the others. God is not uniquely present with me. God is present also with you. So if I want to get closer to God's will, I have to hear it from every direction. And then, as a Muslim, connect it back to those sacred texts which I place at the center of my accountability for myself. So the political and the anthropological are rooted in expectations we have about the ultimate nature of reality. You have to examine secularism too. What are the expectations of secularism about the ultimate nature of reality? Bring it out, look at it, find out what we actually believe, why, and then proceed from there. Because otherwise we're going to be run by all kinds of stuff that's going on from inside us. Just that as those other people out there that we're scared of are being run by all kinds of stuff that's in them. That's really what I have to say about it. The fundamental of everything is becoming conscious of your basic ideas about your own nature and the nature of reality. Find out what you really believe. I'm done.
Thank you.
I can't compete with your beautiful words, but I can have a very simple answer to the question, what is the justification of violence then? If there's an epistemic hardship it's almost impossible to define who is kafir and who is mu'min according to the Quran. I would say very simply, there is no justification of any kind if you just want to go back to the Quran as the resource. Now, the fact that in the history of Islamic jurisprudence, we developed, or others, let's say, others developed these notions of a holy war, of jihad, of violence held in the name of religion, doesn't mean that that can be justified or even can be found in the Quran. And therefore, I started by explaining my methodology first. It sounds a little bit weird to say that I'm going to be using only the Quran. I'm going to isolate everything using only the Quran, not to belittle other things, but there was so much noise surrounding the Quran. I want to be quiet for a while, listen to what the Quran is saying about violence, about jihad, about self-defense. When it comes to fighting, the only justification for fighting is self-defense in the Quran, period. And I know Professor Cole will agree on that because I follow your research, Professor Cole, as well. Self-defense, period. You don't like it, this is what you have in the Quran. The fact now that the expansion of the Arabic Empire required, this alliance between politics and religion and imams, providing free advice to rulers that you can be, there is a kind of unique Islamic dictatorship that you can use. That's fine, they used that. It's history. And I don't argue for the Islamic history as a sacred history, or Islamic figures, even the most important among them, with all respect, as sacred. They're human beings. They take their own decisions, they have their own choices. But my problem now, hijacking religion to justify the sacredness of the Islamic history, right? There is no sacred history, there are no sacred people, right? There are sacred texts though. And as Rabia mentioned, there's a problem of interpretation. And therefore, maybe I'm going to say it's very safe to try to interpret the text by using keys, hermeneutic keys from within the text. Otherwise, maybe I'm going to just follow the game that others played, justifying violence, as an example, for pragmatic reasons, right? For fanatic reasons, for economic reasons. Is there justification for violence within the Quran? No. Period. There is no justification for violence. And I know it's a simple answer to a sophisticated question, but probably I'll leave it at this.
Thank you. Professor Cole, would you like to speak to any of these issues, and also back to that question of the difference between the concept of peace versus nonviolence, strategic nonviolence, and so on?
Sure. Well, we have Rashid Omar among us who laid out some of this in the beginning essay of this book, and maybe he'd like to weigh in as well. But he points out that Galtung made a key distinction between positive and negative peace, and with negative peace being the absence of violence, the absence of war. but positive peace being work in the world that results in harmony and conciliation and avoids violence. I would say that both things are in the Muslim tradition and in the Quran. And in my own essay, I cite some of the verses, for instance, from Al-Furqan 25:63, 64, the servants of the All-Merciful are those who walk humbly upon the earth, and when the unruly address them, they reply, peace. You know, the Jahilun are not the ignorant in the Quran. They're wild, they're undisciplined, they're unruly, and they're ruffians. And so the Quran is saying that when those people accost the early community, they reply with a prayer for them of conciliation and peace. And of course, Salam in Arabic has a semantic field of peace, security, security from attack. For instance, the Safavidic inscriptions of Old Arabic are full of prayers for security from attack. And prosperity is implied in the word as well. And all of those things, security and prosperity and so forth, are being prayed for by the early Muslim community for the unruly who are taunting them and harassing them. Another example in the Quran itself is Al-Mu'minun 23:91 and 96. It says, God has never taken unto himself any offspring, etc. He goes on to say, repel the evil deed with what is better. We know best how they describe. And in a similar verse says that if you repel the evil deed with what is better, can turn your enemy into a patron, into a wali, somebody who would take you as a client and do favors for you. So nonviolence in the Quran is transformative. The person who has the spiritual strength to reply to evil with good is actually engaged in a dialogue with the enemy. And as Rabia Harris said, you know, is making a claim on the enemy to come closer, to remove the enmity and to become a patron. So the Quran not only praises peace as a state and urges the people pray for peace, even for their enemies, but it also urges nonviolent action in the world of replying to enmity with peace. And I think the implication, if you read the whole Quran, is that that's the individual's role in civil society. Of course, the conquering army is coming to kill innocents, then one has to take a stand against that and a defensive stand. But then that's also what St. Augustine and St. Ambrose and the Church Fathers were saying in the centuries leading up to Islam. So it's not actually a contrast or controversial that in ordinary everyday life one should turn the other cheek, so to speak. But there are circumstances in which it's necessary to defend one's community. And finally, I would say that these ideas of peace and strategic nonviolence, as well as committed nonviolence, have played out through Islamic history. I think in India, in the time of the Indian freedom movement, you see both, because Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the Pathan thinker from Peshawar, was a utopian pacifist. He thought Islam requires peace under all conditions, and adopted, the notion of satyagraha, but in a Muslim context, and cited many of the same verses that I have cited in my essay. So for him, it wasn't strategic. But then Abul Kalam Azad advocated for nonviolence, but had a history before he joined the freedom movement of anti-colonial activism, and I think never quite gave up the possibility that in some circumstances war was necessary. So I think that his advocacy for peace, activism against the British Empire was more strategic. You see, Amadou Bamba in Senegal opposed the French culturally while adopting nonviolence and a principled nonviolence, not just a strategic one, as the basis for dealing with the French. And Bamba felt that actually latter-day Muslims don't have the privilege of fighting a battle of Badr, that was something peculiar to the time of the Prophet, and that later Muslims were prideful if they tried to mount a violent insurgency, and insisted that it was necessary to make peace with the French, and instanced the Treaty of Medina that the Prophet made with the non-Muslims of Medina as a basis for dealing with the colonial French. So, you know, these ideas are in the Quran, but they're also played out through Muslim history in ways that, you know, as I was educated in Islamic studies and Muslim history, really were slighted. We didn't hear so much about some of these central figures.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all three of our panelists once again. So, Wala, we're going to have Tom say a couple words. Here we go.